You know, we've all heard the stories about Jacob Waltz and the Lost Dutchman Mine, but it didn't begin with him. Clay, tell us the story about Dr. Thorne and the Apache
The
gold.
story of the Lost Dutchman Mine is so popular that many people think the other lost mine stories of the superstitions grew out of the Lost Dutchman. That's not true. The Dutchman wasn't the first. It was the Lost Doc Thorne mine that came first, and I believe it was the Dutchman searching for the Lost Doc Thorne mine when he discovered what we know as the Lost Dutchman Mine. At any rate, this started evidently in 1865. Doc Thorne was Abram, not Abraham, Abram D. Thorne, evidently named after Abram in the Bible before God changed his name to Abraham. I know nothing about Doc Thorne's medical background except he was actually trained as a medical doctor. But in 1865, he ended up out near Fort McDowell, which was just founded that year. It was initially Camp McDowell, became Fort McDowell in 1865. He settled there and became well known to the Indians that lived up and down the Verde Valley near Fort McDowell.
So why would the Apaches give him gold?
And because of his medical abilities, he sort of fell into the practice of caring for the medical needs of the Indians. And I think there were one or two occasions where he performed a cure that to him was just ordinarily a day's work, but to the Indians appeared pretty miraculous. And so he was held in great esteem by the Indians up and down the Verde Valley. So they came to him one day and they said they wanted to do something for him to in some way compensate him for the help that he had been to the Indians. They wanted to take him somewhere, but he would have to be blindfolded. They put him on his horse, blindfolded him. The horse was led. They traveled for 2 or 3 hours. They crossed water several times, one of which he said was definitely a river, which he always felt was the Salt River. They eventually came to a point where they had to dismount. He was led a short distance, still blindfolded, led by hand. Then the blindfold was removed. Thorne found himself high in a canyon where he had a good view of the country. Some distance away, he said he saw what appeared to be the ruins of a stone-walled corral built out on the end of a ridge. And he said it didn't look to him like an Indian ruin. The only other landmark that he could see was, he said, to the south, perhaps as much as 5 miles away, was a tall peak shaped like the crown of a Mexican sombrero. Then they showed him that he was at the site of an old mine where there was a pile of extremely high-grade hard rock ore. He was told that he might take away all that he could carry. And here he played a bit of a joke on the Indians. They thought he was going to fill his pockets. But it was cold weather. He was wearing long underwear, which he removed, tied a knot in each of the ankles, filled both legs up with rich gold ore, knotted it off at the waistband, sat it astraddle his horse, back of the cantle of his saddle, and, minus his underwear, shivered all the way back to Fort McDowell. The Indians took it good-naturedly. They said it looked like half a man riding behind Doc Thorne on Thorne's horse. On the way back to McDowell, they crossed a creek where Thorne was allowed to dismount. His blindfold was removed, and he was allowed to drink. And at that point, he again saw to the south this peak that looked like the crown of a Mexican sombrero. The blindfold was again replaced. He was returned to Fort McDowell, and the Indians wished the good doctor well with his newfound wealth.
So did he ever go back to try and find it?
Dr. Thorne nearly bankrupted himself, nearly bankrupted his family, financing 2 of his expeditions to try and relocate the source of this mysterious gold. He failed. He traveled to Lematar, a little town out of Socorro, New Mexico, set up a small family practice. And there in 1869, he met C.E. Cooley, Corydon Cooley. Cooley believed Doc Thorne's story and decided to organize his own expedition to search for the lost Doc Thorne mine. He went first to Prescott, where he organized what he called the Prescott Detachment. He sent riders ahead to Phoenix and Wickenburg to organize the Phoenix and Wickenburg Detachment. And when they assembled and rode out eastward to Fort McDowell and into the Superstition Mountains, Cooley led a small army of prospectors. I've heard once that they claim he had 267 men.
All right, Clay, so how was Jacob Waltz part of this story?
And one of the members of the Phoenix Detachment was Jacob Waltz, later to become known as the Dutchman, the founder of the Lost Dutchman gold mine.
Well then, how do we know that Jacob Waltz was part of the search party?
Now again, there is no known roster of the Cooley expedition. But Milton F. Rose, who I think was actually a mining engineer, many years ago wrote a manuscript that he called the Rainbow's End, in which he told the lost Doc Thorne story. And he maintained that a relative of his, that he called Will Rose, evidently William Rose, was a member of one of the 2 Doc Thorne expeditions, and that on that trip he became well acquainted with Jacob Waltz, the Dutchman, sat around the campfire many evenings visiting with Jacob Waltz. Now, there being no roster, I can't prove that Jacob Waltz was on one of the expeditions. But Milton Rose's story about the Dutchman being on the search for the lost Doc Thorne mine explains an otherwise enigma, a question: what in the world was Jacob Waltz doing in the Superstition Mountains in 1869? This logically explains that, so I accept Milton Rose's version. Well, at any rate, that expedition was also unsuccessful. They returned through Fort McDowell, where they disbanded. The Prescott Detachment traveling up the Verde River to return to their homes. The Phoenix and Wickenburg detachments traveling down the Salt River to return to theirs. But when the rest had disbanded and left, only the Dutchman remained behind at Fort McDowell, where he re-outfitted himself and headed back to Superstition Mountain alone. Now, this would seem to be a very foolish thing to have done at that point in Arizona's history of her Indian depredations, which were still active at that time. But perhaps the Dutchman felt that one man traveling quietly alone would be less apt to stir up the hostile Indians than Cooley's small army. Or perhaps the Dutchman felt some sort of impending destiny calling him back to Superstition Mountain. Well, if that were the case, he certainly got that right. But that, again, is another story, perhaps for another day.
So now you know one of the real beginnings of the legends up there in those Superstition Mountains.